So let's talk about another row that's rumbled on this week. Sarah Pochin, the Reform MP, was on talk last week. Taken a while for it to sort of bubble up into the sort of media class consciousness.
It drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people, full of Asian people, full of, people that basically are anything.
What's wrong with that, Sarah?
White.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it doesn't reflect our society, and I feel that your average white person, average white family is like I agree with you, Stuart, not represented anymore.
She basically was having a go, or she was asked by one of the callers on the show about diversity in advertising. Now, everyone's noticed that advertising in the UK is not exactly representative of the country we live in. Maybe that's fine, maybe it isn't. But she said something, I think, very clumsy. She said it drives her mad when she sees adverts for black and Asian people, which is not a very nice thing to say. But I think people understood the sort of broader point that she was driving at. Colin, I mean, no one can really deny that advertising is now basically, is sort of set out to be uber diverse as London, if not more, completely unmoored from what actual, 2025 Britain looks like.
What Pochin said was incredibly inelegant, but I think you're right. I think there was a germ of truth. I know there's a germ of truth. I'd written about it a couple of weeks ago. If representation matters, then it matters for everybody, I suppose, is what it boils down to for me. There was a BBC story about my home city of Bradford and the university there, and reaching 85% non-white student population. And the BBC was rhapsodizing about this in a way that I thought they would never rhapsodize about it in the reverse. So, if representation matters, let's try and explore why it matters and how we got there. I think it's interesting why the advertising industry has arrived at the situation it's got to now, where one study suggested, I think it was more than half of the, not the lead characters, though that was higher than the 4% representation, for instance, of black people in the community at large, but it was far out of kilter, out of proportion. And it's interesting why. I mean, I don't think there's a guiding mind. There's no conspiracy. I think that the sort of collective mass hysteria in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in 2020 prompted some advertising agencies to reflect on the imagined world, the perfectible world they wanted to reflect back at us, and it did amount to a kind of social engineering. On the point about representation, I think we need to be curious as to whenever you get a lack of representation. I think it's really interesting as to how you got there. So one example briefly, and it's not related to race at all. I remember sitting in a Sky editorial meeting ahead of the 5 p.m. show. It's got to be about 12 years ago when I was still there. And it was when Cashier Dugdale had just become the new leader of Scottish Labour. And I said, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because now you've got, Ruth Davidson, Cashier Dugdale, a couple of others, and even the UKIP leader, a guy called David Coburn at the time, who looked like he'd walked straight out of a golf club saloon bar, double-breasted suit, club tie, self-described as outrageously gay. I think 5 out of the 6 party leaders, I may be wrong about this, but it was something like 5 out of 6 of the party leaders in Scotland were openly gay. I think the only one that wasn't was Nicola Sturgeon. And I said, look, this is really interesting, isn't it? How do we, I'm not in any way deploring it. I mean, I'm celebrating it, but yeah. I'm curious as to why you get representation like this. What is it with a sort of critical mass? And of course, total tumbleweed. Now, some viewers may think, well, deservedly so. What possible bearing does that have on anything? I think if we keep being told that representation does matter, then there's nothing wrong in wondering out loud how we got there. I mean, am I right? Am I wrong? I don't know. I just think it's a legitimate question.
Yeah, and that is, if we're talking, to bring it back to the adverts thing, as you were saying, if half of adverts feature a black person and only 4% of the UK are black, it's worth asking what does that have a deeper meaning? And it is quite interesting, I think, that it's not representative even of Britain's ethnic minorities. So, most non-white people in Britain are South Asian, they're not black. I wonder if is it saying that they want to be like America?
Yeah,
perhaps?
sort of America brained.
Yeah, because it's certainly nothing to do with Britain, not even anything to do with London, where all the advertising executives live. Maybe maybe Peckham or Hackney have those demographics. I don't know, but it is fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things as well. Like, what is the point what is the point behind them doing it? And it's often presented as a question of representation, which doesn't really make sense given the disproportions that actually exist. And I think it's because there's a very paternalistic mood within the advertising industry, within the media more broadly, which is that ethnic minorities are so lacking in self-esteem that they therefore need to be able to see themselves reflected, even over-reflected, that therefore that will also, as a second-order consequence, will continue to make people more accepting because they understand that this is it's totally normal to just be a kind of character in an advert and whatever, and to not be white. I mean, it patronises everyone involved to a certain extent, and we all know that these trends exist within these industries. And as soon as someone notices it, they're shouted down.
Yeah.
And of course, what Sarah Pochin said was elegant. The fact that she apologised for it is proof of that. I'm particularly irked. This issue of kind of representation in adverts is not something that moves me particularly, but at the same time, what really does irritate me is the fact that this has led the news agenda for days and days and days. I mean, like, it was treated as the big kind of race relations scandal of the past week, and yet on the weekend we had masked up Bangladeshi Muslim men roaming around Whitechapel in Tower Hamlets saying "Glory for our martyrs," by which they meant Hamas, and inveighing against Zionists. If there is a race relations story that one wants to alight upon and talk about and think, what should we do? Surely it would be that, rather than some comments which were made, regretted, and apologised for in the space of a couple of days.
But it's easy, isn't it? There's a ritualistic quality to going after a politician that misspeaks. There's a kind of bravery required to break new ground and do the story in Whitechapel.
That's very true.
Absolutely. But it was easy, even when Reform UK were doing a press conference, and Nigel Farage was on stage with a grooming gang's victim, and making the case this was a racially aggravated crime. All of the questions were about Sarah Pochin.
On the comments that Sarah Pochin made.
On Sarah Pochin, she said that the sight of brown people and black people in adverts drives her mad.
Can you explain why you don't think those remarks were racist?
Every single one of these medias has said something about a comment that was made by Sarah, which is understandable, absolutely fine. Yet it's taken medias decades to recognise grooming gangs that are coming over and in our children because they're white. That is also racially motivated, and it is racist.
Wes Streeting gave a huge denunciation of her. I found his words very moving, and I would have been much more moved by them had I felt that this was a genuinely racist incident. He talked about the amazing, really important contribution of Black Britons and Asian Britons to the Second World War and things like that. But this occasion just didn't call for it at all. Colin, I don't know what you have thought about that kind of reaction.
Well, I have. I also think it's a legitimate question to ask whether there are any unforeseen consequences of overrepresentation or underrepresentation, whether that's underrepresentation in adverts of disabled people, or women in veils, or whatever it is, and certainly overrepresentation. If you live in one of the many parts of Britain which are still pretty homogeneously white in nature, and you switch on Crossroads or Wolf Hall or whatever it is, and you see a Britain reflected back to you both contemporaneously and historically, which you don't necessarily recognise. And I think it's discomforting for some people, needlessly so, because it's just not borne out by the reality of the statistics.